Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a fascinating look at the very foundation of a nation's intellectual life. And we're examining a truly, I think, counterintuitive claim, the idea that a country's defense establishment consciously defined, structured, and really drove its national educational philosophy for decades.
It's an essential perspective because it really challenges the standard narrative we often hear.
Right.
When you think of defense forces, you think of tanks, borders, national security in that, very physical sense. But the sources we're diving into today argue that true national security is rooted in something deeper,
In what
the
exactly?
quality of education and the moral character of the citizen.
Exactly. And we know you came to us curious about this, about how foundational institutions can shape a national identity, a national knowledge base. Specifically looking at this claim that Pakistan's military leadership fundamentally shaped the nation's moral and intellectual direction. And they did this by viewing education as, well, a strategic imperative.
And our source material provides a really unique framework for this analysis. We're relying heavily on the research and historical synthesis of Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir.
Okay, tell us about him.
He's a constitutional and corporate lawyer, a historian, and an author who's known for connecting these big themes, history, leadership, and faith, through his pretty extensive body of work.
Specifically his Pakistan's Zindabad, the Next World Superpower project. That's what really forms the analytical backbone of this deep dive today. So our mission is to unpack the claim that this process, this continuous military oversight of education, was a deliberate, decades-long strategic operation. And we have to stress, as always, our role here is to neutrally explore the viewpoint and the analysis that's presented in Mr. Mir's work, not to endorse any specific political position.
Absolutely. And the foundational thesis of this material is, well, it's profound. Education is presented as the fortress of faith.
A fortress of faith. What does that mean in practical terms?
It means the core idea, established right from the moment of Pakistan's inception, was this military realization that defense without education is hollow.
That's a powerful phrase.
It is, and it isn't just a motto. It operationalizes knowledge. It mandated that education stop being just a social welfare function and become a strategic mission.
A mission aimed at what?
Aimed at building hearts, not just walls.
That reframing of education as a strategic defense asset. That's the whole key, isn't
It's
it?
the whole game.
If your defense structure views intellectual capital as vital as, say, kinetic capability, you fundamentally alter how you fund, how you structure, and how you prioritize the learning environment for an entire country. This really sets the context for everything that follows, for all the shifts under the different military administrations.
Precisely. It sets the expectation that every policy decision about schools, about universities, about the curriculum, it all has to be evaluated through this lens of national security and national destiny.
And that's what allowed these leaders, who were trained in command and logistics, to feel justified in taking the lead in educational reform.
They saw it as their domain.
Okay, so let's unpack this and jump into the specifics. We should probably start with the very first era where this strategy was institutionalized, Field Marshal Ayub Khan. So when we look at the 1950s and 60s, Pakistan was a very young state. It was facing immense pressures, both internal and external.
Right. Stability and cohesion were the immediate goals. They had to be.
And the sources emphasize that the early army recognized this necessity of institutionalizing how knowledge was acquired right from the start. So why was structure the most urgent priority? And maybe more importantly, why did the military feel it had to take the lead in providing it?
Well, you have to remember, in a new state, civilian institutions often lack. They just don't have the established standardization, the logistical capacity, or the centralized command you need for rapid uniform policy.
But the military does.
The military, by its very nature, has that. It possesses discipline and a rapid execution capacity.
Mm.
So, Ayub Khan's primary concern was creating a talent pipeline that was, above all, reliable and predictable.
If education was strategic,
Then it needed strategic delivery. It's as simple as that.
so what did that strategic delivery actually look like on the ground?
It showed up in the establishment of what the sources call centers of excellence.
Okay, what were these?
These were institutions like the cadet colleges, military universities, and some affiliated public schools. The idea wasn't to educate everyone overnight.
No, it was to set a standard.
Exactly, to establish a gold standard. They became these models of discipline, of rigor, and patriotism, all under the Army's direct or supervised control.
So these were like lighthouse institutions. They were designed to showcase what the national ideal of a student should look like. Disciplined, highly educated, and focused on this national mission.
Absolutely. Think of them as incubators for the future elite. By focusing on standardization, a very strict curriculum, and a regimented environment, these colleges ensured that the future leadership,
Military,
bureaucratic, political, many of whom passed through these systems, they would all share a common, performance-driven, institutional ethos.
And that shared background, that commonality, was crucial for building a unified national identity.
You got it.
Okay, this brings us to a really critical and frankly fascinating claim made in Mr. Mayer's analysis. It's this idea that Ayub Khan's role in establishing the foundation of the educational system, with all this structured planning, that he specifically introduced the concept of meritocracy through education. That's a huge claim for a state that's still emerging from, colonial and feudal structures. How did education practically challenge these entrenched power systems?
This is where we need to dive into the mechanism. Because in the newly formed nation, power was often concentrated based on who your family was.
Right, hereditary land ownership, family connections.
Regional influence, all the traditional feudal systems. Ayub recognized that if modernization was the goal, he had to unlock talent regardless of a person's lineage.
So how did education become the tool for that kind of social engineering?
By creating standardized, rigorous, high-stakes examination systems, and by prioritizing entrance to these elite institutions based purely on intellectual performance, on merit.
So if a student from a humble background could outperform a student from a powerful feudal family on a national exam.
The system ensured the high-performing student got access to the best training. And from there, access to state power, whether it was in the armed forces or the civil services.
Wow. So it effectively severed the direct link between birthright and leadership access.
And replaced it.
Replace it with the link between intellectual effort and national reward.
Exactly. It was a mechanism designed to stabilize and modernize the country at the same time. The sources highlight that this action created the first link between knowledge and nation building.
Knowledge became currency.
It absolutely did. The system rewarded competence. It drove an ethos that if you work hard, if you learn, the state will use your talent. This was indispensable for a defense establishment that needed highly skilled engineers, officers, and administrators.
I find it so intriguing that the military, an institution that's often criticized for its rigid hierarchy, was actually the driver of this meritocratic revolution in the 1960s.
It really speaks to the pragmatism of command structures. The military needs the best talent to function effectively, especially in what was a very hostile strategic environment.
It couldn't afford to be governed by outdated social conventions.
No. Ayub's institutionalization wasn't purely altruistic. It was a strategic necessity for state survival and for building professional capacity. He needed technically sound, disciplined individuals, and standardized education was the fastest, most reliable way to produce them.
So Ayub's core philosophy, which became the early lesson for the nation, was profoundly operational. Nations rise by learning. Learning wasn't optional. It was the foundation of national assent.
It defined education as the active foundation upon which the entire modern state had to be built. His legacy is that initial institutional infrastructure.
The standardized curricula, the meritocratic pipeline.
And the creation of centers that enforce discipline. All of that made the subsequent, more complex educational reforms even possible. Without that structured base, the later shifts would have lacked the institutional muscle to implement change.
That provides a very clear starting point.
Yeah.
Structure, discipline, and meritocracy as strategic tools. Now let's explore how that purpose evolved.
So if Ayub Khan focused on the machinery, the structure of the educational system, the focus under General Zia-ul-Haq represented a fundamental shift.
A shift in the purpose and the content of education.
Exactly. The mandate expanded. It went beyond just technical discipline and structural stability to include moral and religious grounding.
And this shift happened during a period of pretty significant turbulence, geopolitically and internally.
A lot of ideological turbulence, yes.
The sources suggest that the state perceived a deficiency, a kind of lack of moral compass or internal coherence that pure secular discipline alone couldn't provide. What was this crisis of coherence that this new educational philosophy was designed to address?
Well, post-Ayyub, there was a feeling, particularly among certain segments of society, that the rapid modernization and meritocracy had maybe created an educated class that was technically competent, yes, but ideologically rootless,
Or maybe too westernized.
or perhaps too westernized. The sources suggest that Zia's educational policy was intended to solidify the national ideological framework and to explicitly link it to faith.
The goal being.
The goal was to ensure that modernization didn't lead to cultural or moral alienation.
So the answer wasn't to slow down modernization, but to fuse that technical education with a deep ethical anchor. The sources describe Ziel-Huq's key contribution as merging modern education with an Islamic ethos.
Precisely. This wasn't about replacing science with theology. Not at all. It was about ensuring that scientific inquiry and bureaucratic power were exercised within a defined moral and spiritual framework,
To produce graduates who were not just efficient.
but also ethically grounded and committed to the nation's founding ideology.
And this commitment was institutionalized through three specific pillars of educational policy, according to Mr. Mears' analysis. Let's unpack those.
Okay.
They are Quranic education, moral discipline, and civic responsibility.
Let's start with Quranic education. This involved mandatory instruction or integration of Islamic studies across all levels of the curriculum. The goal was to standardize access to foundational religious knowledge,
Ensuring a shared moral vocabulary.
a shared moral vocabulary among all educated citizens, no matter their specialization. You could think of it as an exercise in mass moral literacy.
Okay, and how did moral discipline differ from the structural discipline that Ayyub had emphasized?
That's a great question. Ayyub's discipline was operational, being on time, following orders, standardized testing. It was external. Zia's moral discipline was internal,
Focusing on character.
focusing on character development, honesty, integrity, and adherence to specific ethical codes defined by that religious ethos. It was about shaping the inner person. This involved things like mandatory prayer breaks, an emphasis on modesty, and integrating ethical dilemmas into even non-religious subjects.
And finally, civic responsibility. How did that fit into this moral and religious framework?
Civic responsibility became the application layer. The whole purpose of acquiring all that technical and moral knowledge was framed as a benefit for the collective,
For the community.
for the community, for the state. Students were taught that their knowledge acquisition was not solely for individual gain, but a duty owed to the state, a form of service. This was crucial for reinforcing state legitimacy and social cohesion.
This completely redefined the goal of knowledge for young people. The shift encouraged them to view knowledge not as a tool of ambition, which was really the primary reward under Ayyub's meritocracy, but rather as a profound form of service to Allah and the homeland. That is a massive ideological pivot in the national curriculum.
It is. It elevates academic pursuits to a sacred duty. If your engineering degree or your medical practice is framed as a moral obligation, it fundamentally changes your relationship with your profession and the public you serve.
It aimed to produce a generation less focused on immediate personal gain.
Less on material reward and more on the longer-term ethical implications of their work.
So if Ayyub's meritocracy was about who got power, Zia's educational reform was about defining how that power should be wielded. It was about ensuring an ethical mandate.
Precisely. And that gives us Zia's core lesson. Education without ethics is like power without purpose.
Power without purpose.
The military leadership, in this view, recognized that highly educated, powerful individuals who lacked a strong moral compass could destabilize the nation through corruption or self-interest. The institutionalization of ethical instruction was meant to be the fail-safe.
Providing purpose to the power that was gained through Ayyub's meritocratic channels.
You got.
This must have required a huge amount of institutional change. What do the sources suggest about how the curriculum was practically implemented or what sort of resistance it might have faced?
Well, implementation required significant revision of textbooks, training for teachers across the country, especially in public schools, that were previously more secular in their approach.
I can imagine.
And the sources suggest that while there was some academic pushback concerning institutional independence, the mandate, coming directly from the highest strategic level, ensured its rapid deployment.
So it was pushed through.
Yes. The standardization of religious studies became a measurable metric for compliance. This ensured that this ideological shift wasn't just a paper policy, but a systemic reality designed to institutionalize character development on a national scale. It cemented the idea that the educated class must be ideologically aligned, making the education system the true ideological arm of the state.
So we move from structural discipline to moral discipline. The next phase, under General Musharraf, required yet another massive adaptation.
Right. As we transition into the late 1990s and the early 2000s, the global landscape just dramatically changed.
The information age was taking hold.
It was, and knowledge acquisition needed to be instantaneous and integrated globally. So, following the foundation of structure from Ayub and the anchoring of ethos from Zia, General Pervez Musharraf faced the modernization imperative.
The pace of technological change meant that any system focused only on standardized output risked becoming irrelevant almost overnight.
Yeah.
So what specific actions did Musharraf take to update the education system to meet the demands of this new contemporary global landscape?
The focus was on systemic infrastructural investment, specifically in higher education. Mr. Mir's analysis details several modernization efforts aimed at closing that burgeoning digital and research gap.
Like what specifically?
This included equipping universities nationwide with state-of-the-art computers and internet labs. This was critical for providing access not just to, word processors, but to the entire global network of academic research.
So this wasn't just about providing tools, it was about shifting the culture from relying on physical libraries to engaging with borderless digital information.
Precisely. And hand in hand with infrastructure came the establishment of dedicated research centers. These centers were intended to move Pakistani academia away from being primarily teaching institutions and toward becoming engines of innovation and original research.
And that shift requires funding infrastructure.
And a cultural embrace of inquiry that Musharraf's administration aggressively promoted.
But infrastructure and labs are costly to maintain, and culture is hard to shift. This is where the institutional vehicle, the strengthening of the Higher Education Commission, or HEC, comes in.
Yes.
What was the HEC's condition before these reforms, and how did strengthening it become so key to connecting Pakistani students to global universities?
Well, prior to this period, the HEC was often underfunded. It was primarily focused on administrative bureaucracy rather than, say, quality enhancement. Musharraf's administration recognized that you can't achieve global parity institution by institution. You need a powerful, centralized national body to set and enforce standards.
So what specific levers did the strengthened HEC pull?
Several, according to the sources. First, massive financial investment allowed the HEC to offer competitive research grants. And these grants incentivized faculty to focus on publishing in international peer-reviewed journals.
Forcing Pakistani academic output onto the global radar.
Exactly. Secondly, quality assurance protocols were mandated. This ensured that university standards met international benchmarks, which made Pakistani degrees more credible abroad.
And the most direct way to connect globally.
That was the HEC actively facilitating faculty exchange programs and international partnerships. By funding local academics to study or conduct research abroad, and by attracting foreign professors to Pakistani universities, they institutionalized the transfer of advanced knowledge.
So it formalized those international linkages.
Which was necessary to reverse any perceived intellectual isolation that might have stemmed from the previous era's focus on ideological purity.
That institutional strengthening is the linchpin, isn't it? It ensures sustainability beyond one government's term. It's what drove knowledge to become accessible, borderless, and empowering.
It's the key. Accessible because of the massive investment in physical infrastructure, the labs, the computers. Borderless because the HEC actively pushed for global mobility and research collaboration.
And empowering.
And empowering because, for the first time on a national scale, students were given the digital literacy tools necessary to compete and collaborate instantaneously with their international peers. This phase strategically positioned the nation to leverage the information economy.
It ensured that the talent pipeline Ayub established could operate effectively on the world stage. So the military saw digital mastery as the modern form of defense capability. Knowledge became a global, instantaneous asset that the state needed to control and promote. And this sets the stage for the contemporary focus, where education is fully integrated into the national security apparatus.
And that brings us to the present day, under Field Marshal Syed Asim Munir. This era represents the full realization of that initial thesis we talked about.
Which is?
That education is explicitly viewed and managed through the lens of national security, but in the modern hybrid warfare context.
This is where the stakes feel the highest. National security today isn't just defined by physical borders anymore.
No, it's about economic stability, information resilience, technological sovereignty.
Therefore, the curriculum has to directly serve these immediate strategic needs. So what are the critical skills now considered strategic under this mandate, and how are they being integrated?
The sources highlight three key areas that are now non-negotiable strategic imperatives: AI, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and advanced digital literacy.
These are no longer considered just elective specializations.
No, they are national defense capabilities.
Right.
Education is thus tasked with producing specialized strategic assets, and on a massive scale.
This means curriculum planning is being driven directly by strategic threat assessment and future economic projections. It's a highly targeted approach to developing a specific type of national workforce,
It is.
almost like a wartime mobilization of intellectual resources.
It's exactly that. For instance, developing indigenous AI capabilities is seen as vital for agricultural yield optimization, for logistics, and of course for defense systems. Cybersecurity expertise is essential to protect critical national infrastructure.
So the academic institutions are no longer just loosely affiliated learning centers.
No, they are mandated components of the national strategic infrastructure.
However, producing thousands of AI experts isn't enough if that expertise just sits in a classroom or a lab without any real-world application.
Right. This necessity for immediate economic utility brings us to this crucial element of synergy, the SIFC, or the Special Investment Facilitation Council. Can you explain the administrative power SIFC holds and its role in this educational vision?
The SIFC is designed to be the administrative and policy nexus that forcefully bridges the gap between academic research and industry demands.
Okay, so it connects the two.
Its role is twofold. First, attracting foreign investment in strategic sectors, and second, ensuring domestic institutions can support those investments. Critically, the SIFC facilitates the collaboration of universities and industries to spur research-driven employment.
How does SIFC practically mandate this bridge? Does it involve specific funding, specific policies?
It involves high-level administrative prioritization. SIFC identifies specific sectors of national importance, like IT, mining, or agriculture, and then channels resources toward university research that directly supports those sectors.
Can you give an example? Sure. Funding for, say, a quantum computing lab might be tied directly to a mandate to produce patents or solutions relevant to national defense communications or energy efficiency. This guarantees that research isn't esoteric, but is directly channeled into strengthening the national economic and security posture.
So the result is an immediate high ROI feedback loop. A student learning advanced AI is immediately placed into a strategic project or industry that's facilitated by SIFC.
Right, it maximizes the return on the educational investment.
That's the goal, efficiency and alignment.
It's a closed loop and a highly efficient one. National security identifies AI as a strategic need. Universities adapt their curricula, SISC attracts investment and facilitates industry partnerships, and then the graduates are immediately utilized in research-driven strategic jobs that enhance national strength.
And yet, the sources reiterate that moral education remains the anchor for this entire system, despite this massive technological focus. Why? In the age of AI and cyber warfare, why is character still considered the non-negotiable foundation?
It circles all the way back to Zia's central lesson, but with exponentially higher stakes.
How so?
If you are teaching students to wield AI, which is an immensely powerful, perhaps even destabilizing technology, they must possess a robust ethical and moral framework, one rooted in civic responsibility.
An AI expert who is brilliant but lacks ethics.
Becomes a greater threat than a traditional saboteur.
So the power gained through technology must be guided by the purpose defined by faith and moral character.
Absolutely. The current vision integrates all the previous efforts, the institutional discipline of Ayub, the ethical purpose of Zia, and the technology of Musharraf, all under this highest banner of strategic national development.
So what's the objective?
The objective, which summarizes this contemporary phase perfectly, is that Pakistan's future must be smart, strong, and righteous.
Smart, strong, and righteous.
Smart covers the technological mastery, strong covers the national security and economic robustness driven by SIFC, and righteous covers the moral and ethical foundation provided by institutionalized character education.
It maintains the fortress of faith concept.
Even as the subjects shift from the fundamental text to the highest level of quantum physics.
It is an incredible illustration of how a foundational ideological commitment can evolve and adapt to contemporary strategic needs without losing its core mission.
So now that we've traversed these four distinct eras, we can kind of step back and analyze the structure, the purpose, and the impact cumulatively.
And it becomes clear this wasn't a series of unrelated policy shifts.
No, it was a continuous, adaptive, strategic project.
That continuity is the most surprising takeaway from it. When we review the evolution of learning across these 4 eras of military leadership, we see a logical, cumulative layering process. Each leader really built upon the institutional structure provided by the last.
Let's explicitly trace that evolution, just as it's detailed in Mr. Mear's analysis,
Yeah.
and show how the definition of learning expanded over time.
Okay, let's do it. Ayub, the architect of the system, focused on discipline and structure. He created the institutional backbone, the cadet colleges, the standardized meritocracy, all to stabilize the state and ensure a clean, modern talent pipeline, and in doing so, breaking the hold of some of those old feudal systems of power.
Then Zia added the indispensable moral layer, faith and character. He infused that technically competent pipeline with ideological purpose.
To ensure that the meritocratic winners were ethically aligned citizens committed to collective service.
And addressing that perceived lack of internal coherence.
Then Musharraf provided the 21st century update, focusing on innovation and IT. This was the essential modernization layer. He leveraged the HEC to make knowledge accessible, borderless, and digitally competitive on a global scale.
And finally, Munir's current mandate channels all of this previous development, the structure, the ethics, the technology, into direct strategic output.
Focusing on research and ethics as national security imperatives.
And leveraging SIFC to align academia instantly with the state's economic and defense priorities.
The cumulative outcome, then, is a nation intentionally built through education to be, and I'm quoting, educated in both intellect and soul. This wasn't the result of standard piecemeal planning from an education ministry.
No, it was a centrally driven, long-term strategic project that has spanned decades.
And this brings us back to the profound implications of turning education into a strategic mission.
It does. When a defense establishment adopts this view, intellectual capital is prioritized as the primary resource and the greatest defense asset. The sources summarize this philosophy with a really powerful metaphor.
Which is?
Books are weapons, pens are power, and ideas are armies of peace.
That quote fundamentally redefines the role of the academic, of the student. It puts the pen on the same strategic footing as the gun.
It suggests that the classroom is a front line in the national defense effort.
Which changes the entire perception of educational funding. It's no longer just a social expenditure, but a direct investment in strategic capacity.
And the goal, as we discussed right at the start, was always higher than just standard defense.
Yeah.
It was about building hearts, not just walls.
Right.
The military leadership, in this interpretation, recognized early on that physical fortifications are meaningless if the national spirit is hollow or the intellect is deficient. The educational system became the key mechanism for ensuring long-term national resilience, ideological consistency, and intellectual superiority.
The scope of this knowledge revolution, stretching from the inception of the state to today, is just vast. We've seen the evolution of focus from fundamental ethical guidance rooted in faith and the Quranic mandate,
All the way to the modern cutting-edge requirements of AI, cybersecurity, and quantum research.
and the consistent thread is the strategic management of this process.
Always. Ensuring that the shift toward advanced technology is always anchored by the moral discipline required to wield that power responsibly. This strategic alignment, maintained across 4 distinct military regimes, is what Mr. Mear argues showcases the deep institutional belief in education as the critical determinant of national destiny. It is a long-term vision that transcends immediate political cycles.
It provides a really comprehensive answer to why the military, which is traditionally viewed as an instrument of force, became the primary custodian and driver of the civil education system.
Because they perceived education as the ultimate expression of national survival and the nation's forward trajectory.
What an insightful deep dive into a truly unique aspect of nation building. We started with this surprising premise.
That a nation's defense establishment defined its educational philosophy.
And we meticulously traced that commitment across 4 stages of evolution.
We saw Ayub lay the discipline structure and the meritocratic pipeline. Zia anchor the system with a non-negotiable ethical and moral foundation. Musharraf execute the necessary technological leap to ensure global relevance.
And Munir currently fusing all those elements into a highly focused strategic mandate driven by AI and cybersecurity needs, enforced through mechanisms like SIFC. The surprising consistency of purpose, this determination to ensure that knowledge acquisition remains a strategic imperative, that's the overarching story here. It's an ambitious, decades-spanning vision.
And it's rooted in the belief that the nation's survival and success are inseparable from the disciplined quality of its intellectual output.
And this commitment, as analyzed by Mr. Mir, leads directly back to the bold declaration that underpins the source material.
The goal of achieving the status defined by the project title itself, Pakistan's Zindabad, the next world superpower.
So, we leave you with this final provocative thought from the source material to mull over. If the creation of global research talent, anchored by a deep ethical commitment, is truly the determinant of future global power, how does this specific military-led commitment to integrating ethics, research, and advanced technology, AI, quantum, cybersecurity, uniquely position the nation to fulfill that ultimate source projection of achieving the next world superpower status? Is this strategic emphasis on education the critical differentiator in the coming century?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, exploring how the defense establishment sought to build intellect, soul, and national destiny.
We'll catch you next time.